Guys, so move you're here. I'm going to read the conversation with Shannon Hale next. So here we go. Put it that way. When Megan, my publisher, came with me with the idea of doing an interview for the guide, I started to come up with a list of reasons why I couldn't in my head. Interviews always made me uncomfortable, and really, what question haven't I answered at this point? But then she went on presenting her inspiration of having an interview conducted by another author, and I was intrigued in spite of myself. I was also hanging out with authors, and I don't get the chance but to do it very often. And I also casually suggested my Baffy, best offered friend forever, Shannon Hale, and she was upshot. And the upshot was I got to hang out with Shannon for a whole weekend, and it was awesome. And we did find time to do our interview, which was, without a doubt, the easiest and most entertaining interviews I've ever done. It took place on August the 29th, 2008, which affects some of the directions of how our conversation went. I was surprised when readers thought of how relevant it still is. Here we go. How it all began. Shannon. So, let's look at the 4 different books first. Twilight. It started as a dream. Stephanie Myers. Right, I should tell the story, get it on record. Shannon. Do you want to? Stephanie. I'd like to. This story has always sounded really fake to me, and when publicists told me I needed to tell it because it was a good story for publicity reasons, I felt like a lot of people were going to say, that's ridiculous. She's making up this silly thing to try and get attention. But it's could be nothing but cold hard facts of how I got started as a writer. I usually wake up around 4 in the morning. I think it's a baby thing, left over from knowing it's something in your body needs you, and then you go back to sleep. But that's when I would have the most vivid dreams, those morning hours. And those are the ones you remember when you wake up. So the dream was looking down on this scene. It was in the meadow. There was so much light. The dream was very colorful. I don't know if that's always comes through in my writing. That's the premise that was so brilliant. The sunlight on Edward's skin, it was the most beautiful thing you could imagine. This boy just glittering in the light, talking to this normal girl. And the dream really was about him. She was also listening. As was I, and he was the one telling the story. It was mostly about how much he wanted to kill her, and yet how much he loved her. In the dream, I think I got the way through what was chapter 13 now. The part that he recounts how he felt each specific reason, each specific previous scene, and how it was obvious put together because I hadn't written those earlier scenes yet. But everything else in that scene was mostly what we were actually talking about in the dream. Even analoging about food was something that I got in the dream. I was intrigued when I woke up and sat there and thought, so how does that end? Does he kill her? Because it was really close, how it is in dreams. It's not just that you hear it and you have some kind of feeling that what was going on, and you see everything in the person's head sees. So I knew how close I was, and I mean there, it's just a thin line between what he was going to choose. So I wondered, how would they have made that work? What would the next step be? And the red part of this, so I was intrigued when I woke up and sat there, and so I thought, how does this end? So I recently started realizing that my memory was going, and I could no longer remember who I had said something to yesterday. My youngest was just passing 1. The next one was 2. I had one almost 5 years old. So my brains were like oatmeal. There's nothing left. And so I knew I was going to forget this story. That's the realization of something that would really hurt me. When I was a kid, I always told myself stories that I didn't write, but I didn't write them down. I didn't have any, have, I didn't have to, my memory was great then, so I could always go back and revisit the ones about this. The one that would go over and redefine it, but this was going to get lost if I didn't do something about it. So after the kids got breakfast done, I only had 2 hours before swimming lessons. And even though I should have been doing other things, I started writing it out. It wasn't the dream as much as the day of writing made me a writer, because the dream was great and it was a good story. But if I had my memory lapse, it would have stayed just a story in my head, and I would have figured something else had happened and told it to myself. But that would have been it. But writing it down makes it real. It's beginning to be able to go back and reread sentences and revelations to me, and it was an amazing experience. Wow, this is what it's like to write it down. Stories. I was hooked. I didn't want to quit. I used to paint when I was in high school, particularly won a few awards. I was okay with watercolors. My mom still has them hanging in her house. Slightly embarrassing, but they were decent. I was not a great painter. It was not something that I would have pursued as a career by any stretch of the imagination. I could see pictures in my head, but I could not put them on canvas the same way as it was in my head. It was always frustration. Always a frustration. When I started writing, I immediately had a breakthrough. I could make this real if I write it, and exactly the way I see it in my head. I don't know how I was able to do that, but it was really the experience that made me a writer. So you started writing the meadow scene. Where did it go from there? I continued it to the end chronologically, which I don't always do anymore. So you didn't go back to the beginning because you wanted to know what was happening next. Yeah, just like any reader with the story, you want to find out what happens. The backstory was later. I wasn't really worried about it. I wanted to see where it was going to go, so I kept writing. The last chapter was just getting longer. And this way, and this way, and how does Bella first meet Alice? And what was their first impressions were. One of their first impressions were. So I went back and did the beginning, and I found it really exciting to be able to flesh it out and give reasons for everything that was happening later. I'd letter the chapters instead of numbering them. So when I went back and did A, I think that would have been chapter 13, being E. And because I thought maybe 5 or 6 chapters of material, I would cover beginning, and then I was at 12. I was surprised about that last. And in red text it says it wasn't the dream as much as the writing that made me a writer. And I'm going to stop there and then start on chapter 6. Talk to y'all later. So maybe you're out.